Chicago's Morning Answer.
Volunteers who were given a cocktail of drugs for a year actually aged backwards. Would you reverse your age if you could?
On AM 560.
I'd be willing to try.
I knew it. Are you going to cut your head off and freeze it so you can be put on a robot body in 2150?
Well, if it's got double D's, I'm in. Let's go.
All right.
The Answer.
Dan and Amy, happy Halloween. Just a programming note from our last guest, Sharon Peterson and Kim White, who brought in all their creepy crawly friends. They are doing an event Sunday, January 22nd, Bolingbrook High School. It's called Wild Fest, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. January 26th. 26th, excuse me. Sunday, January 26th, Bolingbrook High School, Wild Fest, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And the proceeds they raise from putting all their the creepy crawly friends on display go to classroom grants for the Valley View School District. So again, Sunday, January 26th, Bolingbrook High School, 10 to 4, Wild West Fest, like we just had in studio for Halloween, and that was a ton of fun.
You know, we should probably put some hand sanitizer on. Because you had the millipede, you had the
tarantula,
you had the bat on your shirt, which I'm going to tweet out a picture of that.
Yeah,
that was nice.
My friends.
You got very involved.
My new
I
friends.
don't know how you did that. And then those hissing cockroaches, oh my gosh. They are actually hissing. And fell on the floor.
Fantastic. Okay, we need to switch gears here and talk about some matters of culture. Yeah, Andrew Sullivan, writing in New York Magazine, and we mentioned at the time, wrote about this many months ago. The idea with the focus on trans rights and the trans agenda, incorporating that into the larger gay rights movement, is going to present some conflicts. Because, and we've seen the conflicts not just with respect to the gay rights movement, but also with respect to the feminist movement. Bruce Jenner wakes up one day and says he's a woman, and now he's at the forefront of the feminist movement. Obviously, some second and third wave feminists have a problem with that, and so do, frankly, some gay people have a problem with the trans movement.
Oh, yes, they do.
And Andrew Sullivan talked about these conflicts that were inherent, and we're starting to see those conflicts present themselves as he predicted. Brad Polumbo took up this topic as well. He is a writer for Washington Examiner and joins us now. Brad, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, Brad, are you there?
Do we have Brad?
Maybe it's
No?
the talk of the spiders and the
I
snakes.
think we scared him away.
Scared him away. That he decided.
Okay, well, why don't we take a break and see if we can line Brad back up to have this conversation I just set up. Brad Polumbo, Deputy Contributions Editor at WashingtonExaminer.com. We'll be right back with him.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Hi, Barry Sterner, owner of Townstone Financial. I could talk to you all day about how I feel about Townstone's service, low closing costs, and great rates. But how about listening to one of our customers?
My name's Elisa French. We've had such good experience with Townstone Financial and specifically Barry Sterner that when my mom was looking to move to Chicago, the first thing I said to her was, she had to call Townstone and got in touch with Barry Sterner, which again, amazing relationship. My sisters, when I am able to ask a question and I have many questions when it comes to this, he really almost holds my hand with his knowledge and explains in such an easy way, and it makes me feel comfortable. So it's easy for me to recommend him.
Remember, nobody values your business more than Townstone Financial, and I'm always available to answer your questions. Call me now, Barry Sterner, 312-896-2111. That's 312-896-2111. Or go to townstone.com. That's TOWNSTONE.com.
Townstone Financial is licensed in Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida. NMLS 136639. www.nmlsconsumerAccess.org. Equal housing lender.
AM 560. The Answer.
Dan and Amy, okay, we have successfully connected with Brad Polumbo, Deputy Contributions Editor at Washington Examiner. Brad, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So you have written a couple of pieces on the topic I was describing before the break, and one of them you headline at your on your piece at Quillette.com. It's time for LGB and T to go their separate ways. What is the conflict as you see it between gay people and trans people and their respective agendas?
Well, it's a question of two fundamentally different things. On one hand, you have groups all kind of that are joined together by sexual orientation, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals. Then on the other hand, you have transgender people who it's something entirely different, right? To say that you're a different gender identity is not related to sexual orientation. So for me, it's always been an unnatural grouping, especially because, in fact, I mean, frankly, you've seen the transgender movement kind of go off the deep end in some of the things they're advocating for, to the extent that they're basically, many of the activists are no longer acknowledging the realities of biological sex. You know, the Equality Act that the Democrats have passed in the House, LGBT rights legislation, would redefine sex under federal law to mean gender identity self-perceived. Whereas, so this is on one hand, you have a group that's essentially saying biological sex doesn't matter. And on the other hand, when you have people like lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, we've actually spent most of our life feeling that biological sex matters a whole lot.
Yeah,
right? That's
exactly.
kind of core to the idea of gay identity. So you're starting to see this rift come through and really announce itself. But in my opinion, they've always been unnatural bedfellows because they're just categorically different, the LGB and the T.
And that's essentially what Andrew Sullivan argued as well. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You're right. And one of the ways you see this presenting itself, these conflicts, I mean, obviously there are gay men and women that participate in sports. And so a gay woman who has to compete against a man identifying as a woman, whether it's a cycling event or a track event or a weightlifting event, that turns out to be a problem whether you're gay or straight, but female.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the underlying reality there is that I think transgender people should live their lives however they want, and they're not hurting anyone, and power to them. But I'm not going to start sitting here and pretending there's no differences between biological males and biological females. And you can't have biological males competing in female sports in all instances and act like that's not going to disadvantage a whole lot of women.
But even the athletes doing it know they're disadvantaging the women. And we still let this happen.
Of them do.
But I mean, it should at some point in time, somebody's got to wake up and say this is wrong, because eventually there's going to be no women's sports at all.
There's going to be no
maybe,
women.
Well, what about him?
No women.
How about this? What about a transgender team? So you have a male,
they don't want
female, and a transgender team.
They don't want it because
because they have to compete against males.
No, because they feel like you're treating them as a freak show. You're a special category. So they've rejected. Most of the commentary I've seen on that idea has been rejected for that reason. But Brad, why the alignment? Does it go to essentially what Rusty Reno has argued for some time? And what the Democrats have been for some time, which is solidarity and marginality, identifying or even creating marginal populations, as they so define them, aggrieved populations, and then stitching them together to try to put together a governing coalition. That's why you have people that are forced together who are, as you describe, inherently in conflict.
Yeah, well, I think it's exactly that. The original grouping has come from this idea of, okay, the oppressed people versus everyone else, right? And it's also come from something else that I think is very important to point out. When you had the gay rights movement, truly very necessary decades ago and fighting important battles, right? You had this setup of all these organizations and nonprofits and groups. And then as the gay rights movement pretty much won and kind of won the day, they needed new frontiers to keep bringing in the fundraising and the attention and keep justifying their salaries, etc. So you've noticed this list, LGBT, just keeps getting longer, the IQA2+, and they're going to keep adding these kind of ridiculous self-parody of identities to the end, like two-spirited, right? Because they're going to need to keep on adding reasons for these advocacy groups and movements to exist and get donor checks and et cetera. Whereas that's why you're starting to see them go into this territory that actually, by dragging us in, I think you've seen, and I think it's, in my opinion, a great thing, the normalization of gay people in America over the last several decades. But the more you continue to attach us to radical ideas like biological sex doesn't matter, biological males in sports, yada, yada, yada. The more you attach us to that, the more you endanger our actual progress that we have achieved, because it could always revert. And I think that that's the real hazard of lumping us in with things that we don't really belong lumped in with, that are much harder, understandably so, for the public to accept.
And what about parental power? I mean, look at the 7-year-old boy in Texas whose mom wants to chemically castrate him a few years down the road, but she says that he is really a she.
Yeah. So that's the story of James Younger, and I covered that for WashingtonExaminer.com in my opinion column. Essentially, what you had here was a parental custody case in Texas where a 7-year-old boy says that he is transgender, and then the mom wants to refer him to treatment, and a couple of years from now start him on puberty blockers based on a 7-year-old being confused about gender. That's not something, listen, that I think most sane Americans are okay with, making irreversible physical changes to young children based on confusion that many studies show young people who have that kind of confusion, a lot of them grow out of it, or a lot of them also grow up to be gay, but they don't need to be shoehorned into transitioning sexes and irreversible gender therapy and hormones. So that's not something, the point of my column was that something like that, something so radical, like, is not something that we should allow ourselves as gay people to be lumped in with, right? We should separate ourselves from that, because the American people are going to reject the idea that a 7-year-old boy or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old should go on puberty blockers and potentially be sterilized. So we need to not be associated with that craziness, or they're going to reject us too.
Although they don't seem to be rejecting the idea that you can identify as whatever gender you want, that gender is a social construct. I mean, I just go back to the treatment Martina Navratilova got when she basically said it's unfair to have men competing in women's tennis or men competing in women's sports generally. And she was excoriated as somehow, a traitor to the movement. I just see very few people willing to stand up to this because there is so much celebration, corporate and cultural power behind it.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the problem with, I think, identity politics in general, is it really doesn't tolerate dissent, right? So whenever you have somebody, whether it's Dave Chappelle, the comedian with his Netflix special, or somebody who really pokes the bear and points out any of this that we're talking about, they get condemned by the woke elite, and they can't work in Hollywood. It's very difficult, or they get blasted by the liberal media. Twitter mobs will come for them. I mean, I had a Twitter mob come after me after I published this essay in Quillette. It's time for LGBT to go their separate ways. So it really is. There's intimidation coming at anyone who dissents on these topics, and that's part of why the backlash against this movement has been slow. But it's still coming, because ultimately, I think people are not going to accept kind of the extension of this ideology into infinity.
He is Brad Polumbo. He's the deputy contributions editor at the Washington Examiner. Check out his piece at Quillette that he just mentioned. I'll tweet it out at Dan Proft as well. Brad, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.